everyone. I'm Michael Serapio. Cyberbullying and online harassment is on the rise. The abuse is happening through social media, direct messaging, gaming platforms, and perpetrators are using this technology to harass, to threaten, to shame, and to scare their targets. Now, in this online harms and cyberbullying town hall special, we are gathering together experts, politicians, representatives of big tech companies, and people who have experienced and delve into the realm of cyberbullying and online harm so that we might identify the problem and, as we go on in our discussion, perhaps come up with some solutions that we could apply in this country. And to that, let's get to the very big question right off top. What is cyberbullying? How is online harms happening? Who does it target? And to talk about this right now, we're joined by Evan Balgert, Executive Director of the Canadian Anti-Hate Network, Amanda Arella, National Director of Public Policy and Advocacy at the YWCA, Raisa Amini, the Youth Engagement Specialist at Children First Canada, Josie Niepanak, President of Native Women's Association of Canada, and Callie Metler, Executive Director of Ottawa Capital Pride. Please welcome and thank you for joining us today. You know, Amanda, I'm going to get you to start up for the conversation right now, because the YWCA recently completed the Block Hate project, and that included research on building resilience on online hate. So that being the case, I'm wondering if you might start us off by talking about what the project found in terms of findings and who is being targeted online.
Thank you, Michael. And so our Block Hate project focused specifically on online hate as it affects young women and gender diverse youth aged 16 to 30. And unfortunately, the reality that the project saw is that that age group and demographic is universally experiencing online hate. And so we did national polling data to understand exactly what the experiences of young women and gender diverse youth is online in Canada, and saw that over 44% talked about experiencing online hate within the last year, often monthly and daily, and 82% of youth said that they have personally witnessed online hate. So we know that it's happening across a number of different platforms online. There was really every modality of social media and internet was talked about from youth that we surveyed. And we also saw that there was really a component that was gendered within that. So not only are young women and gender diverse youth more impacted by hate, the hate that they are experiencing specifically targets their identity.
Evan, let's bring you into the conversation, because as we listen to Amanda there, I'm wondering, why are we seeing such an increase in hate, and do we know where this is actually coming from?
We've observed it as well. So we've done our own polling, and there's been several other polls done which show similar things, that nearly 1 in 2 Canadians have seen or experienced hate, especially more so among youth, gender diverse individuals, and so on and so forth. And there's several places where it is coming from, especially when we're talking about different levels of severity. So we see what I would call just like the background level of hate on the internet, which is, there's this toxic and poison environment that has been created where people are finding people from groups that they like to target and harassing and abusing them. There's also organized campaigns where they pick a particular target. We've seen a lot of that, especially around 2S LGBTQ+ persons, drag performances, things like that. And then the harassment sometimes even goes so far as to result in venues getting threats and bomb threats. Then there's the worst of the worst stuff that we see, which are networks that target youth and vulnerable people and encourage them to harm themselves. And then we are also seeing, in an even more extreme level, groups and networks that produce materials that are intended to inspire terrorist attacks or mass murders. Across the spectrum, there are different kinds of harms. But the reality is today that being online, being part of an identifiable group, can feel very threatening and very dangerous.
Mm-hmm. Josie, I'm wondering if you could build a bit upon that. We were hearing how gendered the attacks are, for example. So I'm wondering from your perspective, what are you seeing in Indigenous communities, in particular, how Indigenous women are being targeted?
Yes, we are certainly seeing an increase in bullying, cyberbullying against Indigenous women throughout the country. And Indigenous women are reporting that through the various forms that they are targeted, and sometimes for reason of ethnicity. And we also are seeing that the Indigenous youth, up to 36% of Indigenous youth have been targeted as compared to non-Indigenous youth in this country.
Callie, could you build as well a bit of what Gord was talking about, or Evan rather, was talking about in terms of the fact that members of the 2S LGBTQ plus community are oftentimes the target of this harassment and hate?
Yeah, we're definitely seeing it, and I think one of the things that's most tangible for me is we see it online and we're seeing it migrate into real life. So as you were mentioning, Evan, venues and other stakeholders, when you're planning events, are now getting threats, and those threats are very tangible. So we're seeing this online space, become very immediate for us at events.
Immediate for you. Raisa, Children First Canada released a report earlier this year. Some sobering numbers, because one of the findings was that in the last 10 years, I'm going to read this, online sexual exploitation of children has tripled. Talk to us a bit more about those findings and the abuse children are experiencing online.
Yeah, absolutely. These numbers are staggering with what you just said around tripled since 2014, and specifically with online sextortion has increased 150% this year, right? And young people are looking for a safe space, the safe third space, which is the online world today. And, they are facing those harms and facing every single day those sexploitation, the sextortion, and the other harms that come into play every day without even them knowing about it, right? And they're just kind of taking it in.
Just taking it in, as you say. And as you share all this, I'm thinking about a survey which CPAC commissioned Abacus Data to conduct for us earlier this year. And out of that survey, they found that 42% of those who responded either had experienced cyberbullying personally or knew someone who was victimized by it. And to that, take a listen to three people who were generous enough to share with us their stories.
Sometimes I wish I could step back because it hurts. It hurts to be turned into a figure for mockery and a symbol of loathing for these far-right groups.
I've struggled with suicidal ideation in my past as well. And I was at the point where I didn't feel like I wanted to keep living either, because all of the people that I cared about were taking their own lives.
If I knew then what I know now, I would have had so many more heart-to-heart conversations with my children about the online world, about people, about relationship building, about trust and communication.
Faye Johnstone, Maddie Freeman, and Carol Todd know firsthand the human toll time spent online can have. In October 2012, 15-year-old Amanda Todd took her own life a month after posting a 9-minute video on YouTube using flashcards to tell her story as a victim of cyberbullying and online sexual exploitation.
I actually didn't know what was going on until the RCMP showed up at my door, right? Telling me that there had been a call and that they were doing a child safety check. And that was the evening that Amanda's offender had posted her image out to the world to get back at her for not sharing more images and not doing videos as he was telling her to, so the threats. Her offender threatened her that if she didn't send more pictures or videos for him, he would put her picture out on the World Wide Web. And so he did. After that, when I became aware of it and attempted to have conversations with my daughter, she, being a teenager, was embarrassed, right? And she didn't want to talk about it. And then eventually, when she was re-threatened again by this person, she came to me, and then I realized with Facebook was one of the platforms that her offender used, how difficult it was. I couldn't find the report button because there wasn't one. I couldn't find a phone number. I couldn't find an email address. I couldn't find anything.
In the 12 years since Amanda took her life, the number of social media platforms has exploded, with the digital advisory group Kepios reporting that by July 2024, there were over 5 billion social media users around the world. Billions of users and countless hours being spent online. Maddie Freeman was one of those users. At 12 years old, she struggled with depression and anxiety.
So at that time, I didn't realize how much social media was negatively impacting me until I got to high school and I saw some pretty extreme experiences from my peers. I lost many friends to suicide throughout my years of high school into college. To see my whole community in shambles because we just kept feeling like these deaths were never going to end. So for me, the only antidote to being able to continue on and feel okay with myself was to take action. I knew that something needed to be done about this.
Maddie founded No So November, a global advocacy movement aimed to get teenagers offline in November and provide educational tools to empower teens when they are online. Women, children, vulnerable, and Indigenous communities all experience higher rates of online abuse and cyberbullying, according to Statistics Canada. Transgender woman and activist Faye Johnstone was not prepared for the online abuse she began experiencing as her advocacy work increased.
The piece of that was hard was that no one knows how to support or help. And so you're seeing something that you didn't expect. It's about you, it's personal and it's targeted. And you don't have anyone to tap in to say, hey, like, this is really rough. This is also something that a lot of people don't see because it happens online, and it's you mob somebody's Twitter mentions, and not everyone around me is seeing that. So it would happen to me almost in this silent little corner that is very personal to me, but that's not necessarily getting seen by anyone around me. It's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking, and I have a hard time. I'm a strong, proud, happy, confident human, but it does. You internalize all of that hate when you see it all of the time. And you see also what it does to your community. I have parents of trans kids who are scared to speak out about what's going on for their children because they know the risk is higher for them to be targeted because they see what happens to me.
There's always concerns about safety, about cyberbullying, online abuse. I think teens are very aware of these problems, but the problem is that social media has become so ingrained into our world and into our social circles that we feel trapped on the platforms. A lot of teens struggle to find a healthy relationship with social media because everyone else that they're connected to is on it and using it actively.
I never thought that a predator from across the waters, like in another country, would come after my child. But the internet has no boundaries. There's no door, like the front door of your house anymore when it comes to being online. So people can come from all over the world and appear in your house through the online world.
So, 3 powerful stories from individuals whose lives have been affected by cyberbullying and online harassment and abuse. Carol Todd's daughter, Amanda Todd, lost her life to suicide in 2012. Maddie Freeman talked about contemplating suicide and losing her friends to suicide, and Faye Johnstone talking about the abuse and threats she receives online as an advocate. Evan, it's hard not to be moved by those stories, but I'm wondering if we can go back a little bit. When did we start seeing and tracking this type of online abuse?
This kind of abuse has existed as long as the internet has existed. What has changed is the mechanisms by which it happens. Everybody has become concentrated on platforms, and we have created this culture of harassers earning fame and money for tormenting other people, where they can build an audience that eggs them on, and they go after target, usually picking on somebody's identity. So what's new about it is that there are rewards and no punishments for this kind of behavior. Social norms seem to be breaking down in that people are less ashamed to be engaging in this kind of harassment of others. I recall when we started doing this work, if you found out who was behind some kind of far-right awful activity and named them and shamed them, that might make them disappear or at least stop that behavior 70% of the time. I'm just pulling numbers out of my experience here. I don't have a poll. But it feels that number has gone down. That naming and shaming of individuals is less effective, and people are being incentivized for doing these kinds of harassment campaigns.
Mm-hmm. Risa, I'm wondering if you could talk to us about the impact this abuse actually has on the mental health of young people.
Yeah, absolutely. So within our report, we found that about 1 in 5 Canadian young people experience cyberbullying and online harms. And that stats kind of follow with, they may be experiencing some mental health challenges, whether that be anxiety, depression, or even greater, such as suicidal ideation and attempt, like what Maddie had said earlier. And young people are struggling because there's been an onus on young people to learn more about media literacy, and even parents. Within our report, we found that 65% of them feel not equipped to deal with the cyberbullying that's been happening within their own young people's lives. So it's a really tricky thing where we try to empower young people to learn more about the harms that they may be experiencing, but the supports are not there for them to take action.
Callie, what would you say about the impact on mental health when it comes to the 2S LGBTQ+ community?
Yeah, I think the 2S LGBTQ community has historically been asked to open up, to come out, to be yourself, to be authentic. And I think that is very important for us to feel free to do so. But I think, online hate that we see and cyberbullying, that affects us by keeping ourselves secret, by keeping more things close to the vest. And I think that feeling of, you can't be your true self, you can't share, I think that really affects people's mental health.
Mm-hmm. In November, the Canadian Mental Health Association, they released a report on the state of mental health in this country, and they found that mental health is 3 times worse right now than before the COVID pandemic. They also found that 38% of Indigenous people reported their mental health as being poor or fair. Josie, when we add online abuse and cyberbullying to this, can you talk to us about the impact that you're seeing in Indigenous communities as a result of this type of harassment, and perhaps not just the community in general, but also on Indigenous women?
Yes, thank you. Certainly that percentage does not surprise me, that there is an increase in terms of Indigenous women and the feelings of bullying and the hate speech that's attached to it in terms of Canada's history with Indigenous peoples and in terms of the colonial constructs that we have had to live in. So that further perpetuates the feelings of isolation, the feelings of forced assimilation, and the feelings of not being part of the Canadian fabric the way in which we want to be, the feelings of rejection. And so that increases the vulnerabilities of Indigenous women and children and youth in this country. And so therefore we feel the same. We feel the anxiety, we feel the depression, we have the suicide ideation, we have all of those issues as everyone else. Only it's more because of the history of Canada. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I'm thinking about this rising trend and services. And so, Amanda, I wonder for you, as we talk about an increase in online harms, an increase in cyberbullying, are there the services to actually address the need?
I think more and more organizations are pivoting to be able to address that need and provide services not only for people who are experiencing online harms, and particularly for youth, but for the trusted communities in their life who might be able to help them respond and help them build resilience to this kind of hate. But unfortunately, there needs to be resources to support that kind of engagement and capacity building. And that's a place where YWCA Canada is really calling for change. I think the other piece that we have to be cognizant of is, as we've heard a number of times, young people and everyone still remain in online spaces and particularly see social media as a place to build community, and so need to be able to do so safely, and organizations who are supporting that kind of community building also need to be able to engage safely in online spaces. And I think there's not quite yet an ability to fill that gap to ensure that service providers and community organizations can be online to support their community in a virtual way and do so safely for everyone.
I want to get back to that survey that CPAC commissioned from Abacus Data. And, David Coletto is the CEO and the founder of Abacus. And among the things we asked him to look into was to just measure what Canadians are saying about online harassment, about cyberbullying. Take a listen to what David Coletto and Abacus Data found.
Well, look, I ask Canadians, hundreds of questions every week about a range of things, and to find, close to 90% believing that something is a problem. These days, it's rare to find us all agreeing on a problem. This is an indication of how widespread public recognition is of the problem. Unfortunately, it doesn't really surprise me because I think we've heard anecdotally lots of stories of both women and those in racialized communities saying, I feel more targeted, I'm more likely to be targeted from this. This survey just counts it up and shows just how widespread overall people's experience with cyberbullying is, and how those in particular demographics seem to be the targets of it more, and it's more frequently happening to them. And so, yeah, it's not so much a surprise, but it should shock us, right? That there are certain people in the country who seem to be getting the brunt of this bullying, and it's simply because of who they are, not necessarily because of anything they've done.
So, David Coletto of Abacus Data, and again, the numbers here, 90% of Canadians believe there is some problem with online abuse. And in that same survey, 80% of respondents said cyberbullying was one of the most significant challenges, dangers facing young people. You know, Amanda, as you were listening to David there speak, I'm wondering if this backs up the kind of numbers, trend lines that you're seeing with the YWCA. And as you answer that, I'm also wondering if you could build on it. Like, where is this actually coming from? Are we talking about social media? Are we talking about DMs? Are we talking about gaming? Can you break down where this is actually originating?
Absolutely, and I think without question, we're seeing the same sort of trends in our own research and our own work at YWCA, not only in the levels of online hate and harm that young women and gender diverse people, particularly those who are members of racialized communities or newcomer communities or 2S LGBTQ+ communities are experiencing, but also that overwhelming consensus that this is an issue that people should be taking action on. And what we know is that, unfortunately, the harms can originate from any source online. And so social media, I think, is one that we have mentioned a number of times and is a clear place where we're seeing this harm happening, but it can happen on a myriad of online platforms, in public conversations, in private conversations, in DMs. And there needs to be a sort of nuanced approach to addressing these individual ways that online harm can manifest.
You know, you mentioned nuance. I'm also wondering if there's a way of nuancing, you know, the source person or organizations. And Evan, I'll ask you to talk about that, because are we talking about an individual using social media or these platforms to abuse? Are we talking about bots? Are we talking about coordinated efforts? And where, if at all, is a region targeted?
So different platforms vary in how much they have created an environment of hate and abuse. And in particular, you know, these platforms have been driven for a long time by profit motive, by maximizing engagement at the cost to their users. Now we see, you know, the evolution of that. Certain platforms have become much, much worse than others, because some have leaned even further into that. And with Elon Musk's takeover of Twitter and X, we have now seen not just a profit motive behind this very large company, but what seems to be an ideological motive behind Musk replying to white nationalists, trying to use Twitter to influence the politics of the country there. So he has created a space that is hostile towards people who would advocate for human rights and amenable to people who would advocate against human rights. So it varies platform by platform. And as I said before, in terms of like where it is coming from, there is a lot of hate, and it gets fomented and whipped up by a fairly small number of individuals who have become content creators or started sort of like fake news platforms and things like that, that manage to whip up people into a frenzy to then go after particular groups.
You know, Risa, we heard Amanda talking about people turning to these platforms as a way to perhaps build community. And with that in mind, do you think young people realize the dangers, the potential dangers that they face?
I would say they're starting to, right? With the rise of media literacy within our education system, but just with the conversations that's been happening online more increasingly throughout, you know, COVID. You know, during COVID, it was the start of like people talking about media literacy, and I think I do want to bring up that, you know, many young people are digital natives. Right? So they are very familiar with the concepts of social media and seeing that as a third safe space, very relatively in question. But I think with more awareness and more education, and even though we have the onus of making young people to learn more about media literacy, but can we push that into the broader system, within our education system, or even the policy, right, in regards to the legislation within some of these social media spaces?
Mm-hmm. Callie, I'm wondering if you are a member of the 2S LGBTQ plus community and you find yourself being targeted or victimized by this type of harassment, this cyberbullying, what is the recourse? Are there services, supports for members of the community?
I guess the short answer is no, not that I've found or been able to take advantage of. And I think just as we were all speaking here, something that kind of struck me is, for me personally and for many in my position, it's not just in the personal sphere on social media, but it's also at work. My inbox has been a very nasty place, and that just has massive effects on community, right? So when we're talking about your identity being part of the work that you do, and then being thrust into that spotlight, and having this kind of online presence, it's a scary place for sure.
Mm-hmm. Josie, I wonder if you could talk to us about supports, whether there are any for Indigenous women and their families who become targeted or victimized through online.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. Currently at Native Women's Association, we do have a program called Safe Passage, and in the program we have a component on cyberbullying and violence, and offer safety advice, where to go, resources, how to protect themselves, those kinds of things. And so, having said that, we're not reaching anywhere near enough of the folks that we need to. One of the research documents that I read just recently said that Indigenous women youth should be researched separately because of our lived experiences, which are different based on the colonial constructs that I previously mentioned. And so the research needs to be targeted towards Indigenous women youth, due to poverty, sometimes don't have the resources that are required to keep individuals safe. But I do believe that schools have a responsibility. IT companies have certainly a bigger responsibility. Government has a responsibility to create safer spaces within social media. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Listen, I'm going to ask you to hold on to those thoughts because we'll continue the conversation, but I also want to bring in another statistic, again, from the survey that was done by Abacus Data after being commissioned by CPAC. And in that poll, they found that 58% of respondents said online hate and bullying was a deterrent for qualified people who are considering running for public office. Now, we know that politicians from all levels, federal, provincial, local, are facing more abuse, more online harassment. And we did speak to a few politicians about their experience with this type of online hate. Take a look.
The very first times I received online abuse, I sometimes reached out to the person and said, well, why are you talking like that? But then I would be inundated. There's times when there's sort of like, almost like a concerted campaign to just drive you off Twitter or drive your Facebook into the ground, and you can't keep up. So it's in the morning, I get up, I get a cup of coffee, and I block, so that the people who are on my site are people who want to talk.
Well, it's awful, and it wears on you, quite frankly. This is a vocal minority, but they're bullies. They like to intimidate, and it's difficult, especially if it involves family. I think that's one of the hardest, if somehow family gets brought into it. An MP talked about an email that they received threatening to rape his wife. And I've had media say to me, and people have written, well, this is what you chose to do. You need to get thick skin and toughen up.
The hate started pretty soon after I became Minister of Environment and Climate Change. Now, it's kind of quaint. I was called Climate Barbie, although it wasn't all that quaint. If you looked at the tweets, they often, had like violent acts where they would crush a Barbie. It was pretty brutal from the start, but I ignored it. My team was said, like, do not do anything with this. You will look weak. You'll get drawn in. And then one day I was at the United Nations. We were talking with world leaders about climate policy. And I noticed that Jerry Ritz, who was a colleague, a conservative in the House of Commons, had tweeted something about, something stupid, how stupid I was in Climate Barbie. And I just said to my team, I was like, okay, folks, like, I'm saying something back.
I had multiple death threats. I had a woman incarcerated not once but 3 times as a result of this. And in the 2022 election, I just couldn't take anything anymore. I was being targeted and harassed, not just online but in person. And I decided to self-harm to stop it because my world became incredibly small. I was suffocating and I wanted to die. And a lot of this was because of online trolls without any sort of name or identifier around them, but who felt that they were able to get to me very closely and to personalize things, including with my family, and really wanted to eliminate me. I ended up in the hospital.
When I started to get the first death threats online, I was really shocked, and I was shocked that there seemed to be so little I could do about it. When people are saying, you're being hunted, you're never going to see it coming, tell your family to arrange a funeral. Well, is that just an idiot in their mom's basement, or is that someone who actually is going to do it? And I think the bigger area of concern that I have is that it's not threat A or person B that is going to actually follow through to the result. It's when you create an atmosphere where threat is seen as normal, that someone else will act. And that when you demonize public officials to such a level that it's not just the swears and the hate, but the actual threats, it will trigger someone who's probably unstable to do something. And it's not just members of parliament. I'm talking to municipal councillors who are facing this in small towns. I'm talking to provincial MLAs.
That's every day for some politicians, including me, feeling like there's no allies, there's no light, there's no support. And when you start to internalize that, you not only are dehumanized in the bully's face, but you start to dehumanize yourself too. And you have no self-esteem left. And for those of us with an underlying mental illness, it can be deadly.
I do report it, and the response from the police is quite frankly underwhelming. Usually the response I get is, what would you like us to do? Or, we have 3 options. We can do nothing, we can phone the individual, or we can look at pressing charges. What would you like us to do? And my response is, you're supposed to be the experts, but at the very least, I want you to call the individual.
Social media companies need to be held accountable. Like the online harms bill, I think sometimes government gets caught up in being worried that it looks like they're controlling speech or it's something to do with freedom of speech. Hate speech is not freedom of speech. It's just not a thing.
I think that there needs to be tools in place to address these threats of democracy in a better way, so that the lone municipal council or the lone member of parliament's not having to face these on their own by dealing with police and trying to deal with the courts. I think there are tools that could be used to lessen the threat and menace, but right now everybody's waiting to see what happens next.
I really worry now. Like when I look back, it was definitely bad. It sucked sometimes, to be perfectly honest.
If we're not careful, someone is going to be hurt either at the hands of one of these perpetrators or threats, or it's going to be at their own hands. I think that suicide is going to be a very big issue for us as we move forward, and we cannot underestimate the impact of this online hate.
Now, the Samara Centre in Toronto, they use a machine known as a SAMbot to analyze millions of comments made during elections. It also helps provide some insight into how this type of harassment and abuse is affecting our politics and our democracy here in Canada. And to that, take a listen now to the CEO of that company, Sabrina Delon.
If you want to seek elected office, entail a high volume of abuse that will be quite severe. And so we need to think about this as conditions of work so that we can bring this conversation down to earth. These are people who are elected to serve our interests. They're meant to serve the public. What conditions do you want your representative working under so that they can do their best for you? And violence occurring in a digital format is still violence. And so we're facing such complex challenges right now with our democracy related to trust, risk, and information. And we need to be responsive to these realities of what it's really like to be an active citizen offline and offline, because there's a connection. And the reality is people don't feel safe performing these roles. And if people don't feel safe performing them, then they're not going to step forward. Or increasingly, we'll be attracting people who also want to facilitate this type of violent and uncivil behavior, which is going to have a very corrosive and damaging effect on the practice of our politics in Canada.
So, a bit of a snapshot as to how this online abuse is affecting politicians and, by extension, our democracy in this country. You know, when you add that to the discussion that we as a group have already had, I'm going to ask each one of you to just share your thought. What is your biggest concern, your biggest fear, if we don't address the problem and come up with some type of solution to make sure this doesn't spread and get worse? Evan, I'll get you to start.
I'd also like to react to something that we saw there, where these are, in some cases, sitting members of parliament. And they have a lot of privilege and a lot of power. And even they feel helpless, in some cases, going to law enforcement. But many other people don't even have close to that privilege. They're not having law enforcement ask them, hey, what can we do, and giving them options. They're having law enforcement not take their report, or not take it seriously, or say there's nothing we can do because it's online. So I just want to acknowledge that I have a lot of sympathy for that. The regular person out there has it, unfortunately, a lot worse if they are the target for these campaigns. My fear for the future is the normalization of this harassment has already led to people being murdered and killed. And it will continue to do so in the future. And on the horizon right now in this country, I don't think that we are moving in a direction where that is going to lessen.
What would you say?
I echo Evan's fear that I think there's a great risk of online harms translating into offline violence and offline loss. And I also worry that what we're seeing and what is being experienced is that young people and young women and gender diverse people in particular are stepping away from public life. They are stepping out of online space. They're stopping, they no longer share their perspectives and opinions and their passion for perhaps changing the world, which is something YWCA so desperately wishes to foster. And instead they're disengaged. And I think that is concerning for the health of our democracy now, but also very much in the future as we look to think about who may serve as elected officials and shepherd our country into the future as well.
Callie, what's your biggest fear?
That we will continue to be pigeonholed and to deal with these abuses and bullying on an individual basis. I think having conversations like this are a good start to be able to quantify and to understand the quality and the depth of what's going on online, because as we've been saying, it can often be a very individual experience. So I think just making spaces to talk about it is both a positive, but it's also a very scary thing to step into. So I worry that people won't feel that they have the space to have conversations like we're having today.
Josie?
Yes, the numbers are very frightening. My biggest fear is we're going to see more people dying. I mean, the rate of murder of missing and murdered Indigenous women in all of their diversity, the numbers are much higher than it is for non-Indigenous women. And that is the same stat for Indigenous youth as well, who are dying at the hands of cyberbullying, at the hands of other sources, including government as well. And so greater legislation, policy, we need to protect the most vulnerable people in this country. And unfortunately and sadly, it is, as the numbers state and the investigation state, it is Indigenous women and children and youth and families. We could do much better.
Risa?
Absolutely. And I think my biggest fears, I would share too, is that the numbers of many young people within Canada keep increasing with the online sexploitation, sextortion, cyberbullying. These numbers will just continue driving up, and it will actually impact, other systems such as the healthcare system, right? Around the mental health care and having that social support in order for a young person, whoever is going through that cyberbullying, feel supported and have the adequate access. The many young people that I work with, they are empowered to take on this challenge with policymakers. So why don't we put them in directly at the seat at the table, right? And they can provide their lived expertise and provide innovative solutions rather than putting the onus back on the kids and the parents in order for them to feel safe on social media.
Risa, thank you, and really thank you to all of you for starting our discussion as we look into online harms and cyberbullying and in this town hall. Evan Balgord of the Canadian Anti-Hate Network, thank you. Amanda Arella, YWCA, thank you. Raisa Amani, Children First Canada, Josie Niepanak of the Native Women's Association, and Callie Metler of Ottawa Capital Pride, thank you. Thank you for this discussion.
Thank you so much.
So we have just talked about the problem, who is being affected by online harm and cyberbullying. Well, let's switch the discussion now and focus on solutions, what we might be able to do about this. And to take part in this discussion, we're now joined by Matthew Johnson, Director of Education with Media Smarts, Agnès Bussière-McNichol, Lawyer and Director, Fundamental Freedoms with the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, Jayden Braves, CEO and Founder of Young Politicians of Canada, Anuruddha Dugal, Executive Director of Women's Shelters Canada, and Cynthia Koo, a technology and human rights lawyer. Hello to all of you. So let's begin with the premise. If someone is being cyberbullied and abused online, what tools are actually in place that they might access? And I'll begin with you, Matthew, because I'm wondering what resources Media Smarts has available for someone to understand what they can actually do if they're being victimized.
We have resources that are based on the research we've been conducting for almost 25 years that help to, first of all, prevent cyberbullying by allowing teachers and parents to help kids develop the essential skills they need to manage conflict online, to manage their own emotions, and to take effective action when they witness cyberbullying. And these also provide tools for kids to use when they experience cyberbullying themselves. They provide strategies for dealing with it and options for reporting it, and in particular for reaching out to different sources of help and support, because we know that really that is what's most important for young people, is feeling that they have support, feeling that they're not alone.
Feeling that they're not alone. So how important is parental involvement in that fight?
It's tremendously important. We've found throughout our research that having a connection between parents and kids, having an open conversation, and having rules in place in the home, not necessarily rules that are based on punishment, but rules that are establishing routines, that are establishing values, and in particular establishing that kids can come and talk to their parents anytime something goes wrong, have a huge impact on how kids behave when they're online and on their experience when bad things happen to them, including cyberbullying.
You know, Jayden, I think you are the youngest panelist being involved in this town hall. So as you hear Matthew talk about the types of resources that are available, is that even talked about among young people? Do they know? Are they sharing information with each other?
Yeah, thank you, Michael. I think as a 16-year-old and somebody that's advocating heavily for this work on the internet, I think you just have to look at the facts. You have to talk to some young people and see what's actually going on the day-to-day on the internet. And at the end of the day, there aren't resources. You scroll on your phone, you listen to what MPs had to say a little bit earlier, but you can see there aren't phone numbers to call, there aren't emails to type, and the normalization of exchanging nudes or pornographic content or hatred, that's totally seen as acceptable amongst people my age, amongst people younger, amongst people that I see in grade 5 or 6 getting access to cell phones. There's no front door you can close, as Amanda said. There's no limitation to what you can see. The first thing you see on the morning is your cell phone. That's exactly what you're looking at, what you're checking for, what you're being stimulated by. And to put it on parents and to put the onus on parents is also really difficult because you alienate certain students that don't have parents that maybe are as attentive. And if you can't standardize the way that young people are receiving information, then you really have a lack of fairness throughout young people.
Okay, yeah. Perhaps we can get into that a little bit later, but Anuda, I'm wondering in terms of women's shelters, the supports that are available to women who step forward to say that they've been victimized by online harms, are those available?
So shelters have told us, 95% of shelter workers have said that the violence that women experience, domestic violence, gender-based violence, intimate partner violence, is exacerbated by online harassment, threats, and online monitoring and surveillance. These are the 3 top forms of violence that they're experiencing. So Women's Shelters Canada has a program that is training shelter workers so that they know how to respond when they receive that information, so they know how to help women protect themselves, so that women think about the location tracking apps on their phone, or they think about what kind of information is being shared by their apps that they're maybe not aware of when they come into the shelter, or even the type of communication that they have to have with somebody who may be an abusive partner around taking care of children or following legal proceedings. It's not someone you can block in these cases. So what we're trying to do is say that when you have to have a relationship with somebody who is abusive, you know they're abusive, there have to be protections in place so that that relationship doesn't extend to you feeling unsafe online because of the behavior of that particular abuser or their family or their friends, because people will also pull others into the online abuse.
So abuse, online harms, I wonder, Cynthia, does this qualify as a human rights issue? Are there laws that people can actually use to fight back if they are victims of this type of abuse?
Yes, it absolutely is a human rights issue. So we heard from the panel earlier that online abuse amounts to chilling of people's freedom of expression. So they will self-censor, they will withdraw from online spaces and withdraw from public participation, which is crucial for having a healthy, open and free democracy. And a lot of people, when we talk about regulating the internet, regulating online hate, immediately see it as a freedom of expression issue, but it's just as much, if not more so, a right to equality issue. Because if historically marginalized groups are systematically targeted every time they speak out, then they don't have freedom of expression. Because what does it mean to be able to speak freely if every single time you dare open your mouth, you're hit with a wall of hate speech and rape threats and death threats? In terms of laws to address it, there are some. For example, there are criminal offenses such as stalking, cyber or otherwise, or for criminal harassment. And there are also laws that will let people sue individuals if they happen to know who they are, if they aren't anonymous, for privacy invasion or online harassment, for example. But these laws leave a lot to be desired when it comes to online abuse because, one, they don't cover huge swaths of behavior that would constitute online abuse. Two, a lot of victims, research has shown, don't actually prefer to engage with the law because they themselves have had bad experiences or are over-criminalized, so they prefer non-legal recourse that's available. But the third, and one of the most major factors, is that these laws don't address the platforms themselves. And as we heard earlier, their business models are optimized to help this problem proliferate. And we know this because previous reporting and whistleblowers have explained that even when at Meta, at Facebook, at YouTube, their own employees raise these problems, point out that our systems are facilitating this kind of online abuse, and here are some things, here are some tweaks we could make to fix that. those initiatives get shut down internally because higher level management knows that it's going to hit their bottom line.
So let me pick up on that and bring you into the conversation, Annalise. When you think about the laws that are available, limitations otherwise, do they go far enough?
It's a very interesting question, and my answer to that is that they could do a much better job, and there's room for improvement. As Cynthia mentioned, legislation and recourses exist, but it's sometimes very difficult for people to access it. And one very big flaw of this type of legislation and recourses is that they place a very heavy burden on the shoulders of the alleged victim to carry the lawsuit, to establish that there was defamation, to make a complaint to the police if they believe that a criminal offense has been committed. That being said, I also don't think that we can legislate our way completely out of this issue. I think that prevention, education, community supports, those are all very important tools that we will need if we are to effectively fight online abuse.
So I'm wondering then, when you consider what's been shared here, and I'll go down this and I'll ask for a very quick answer from all of you. What can we do to make what exists better?
I think a really important thing is to educate people about the tools that are available to them. And that education isn't just going to be about using those tools, it's going to be about understanding the purpose of those tools. So we know, for instance, when we look at the law against sharing intimate images, which is a very strong law here in Canada, knowing that that law exists in our research did not mean kids were less likely to share sex. The kids who were aware that that law existed were not any less likely to share sex than those that didn't know about it. And that is because they didn't feel it was likely to be enforced. They didn't feel that it was likely to be used as a consequence, and also because they felt they, in many cases, were justified in what they were doing. And so in the same way that household rules that parents put in place have to be about communicating values as much as about laying down the law, in the same way our approach to laws has to be about educating people about why these laws exist and helping people who are targets of online harms see the law as something that helps them rather than something that is going to further victimize them.
Anais?
I think a priority would be to know what victims need. Is it to be compensated for what they're suffered? Is it for the abuser to be sent away to a prison? Or is it for the speech to be taken down very quickly? And then we have to ask ourselves who is in the best position to, for instance, take down the speech. And of course, I'm sure we'll have the opportunity to discuss this, but we also have to balance this with freedom of expression.
I'll ask each one of you to answer as well, just a bit shorter. Cynthia?
Sure. So one thing we can do to alleviate some of the suffering given the current status quo is to make sure that all possible frontline contacts that a victim of online abuse might come into contact with is actually educated on this issue. So whether that's teachers, police officers, social workers, research has shown that people can get re-traumatized by not the initial what happened, but by when they reach out for help, the help being unresponsive or not understanding or itself being re-traumatizing. So that's something before we even get to the actual root problem, just to offer greater support to those experiencing it is the first step.
Anuruddha?
So the violence and abuse through technology that people are are being affected by is really stopping them from getting access to basic rights, like they can't use, let's say, online banking if they're using their smartphone. That might be a method of multiplying or amplifying abuse, whether it's direct messaging, it might be their the way that their smartphone, the messages that they get, the way that they're interacting online, and that's that's a basic right because they should be able to use their smartphone to find housing if they need it. They should be able to use it to find employment that they need. So it's not realistic to ask people to stay offline or to minimize their interaction with online activity. So we need to get away from that kind of thinking, and we need to move into absolutely believing that this sort of abuse is happening, understanding the danger of it, and having recourse that, as we've said, is not always about the law or the police or bringing charges, but having recourse that makes the abuser responsible to stop in a way that doesn't necessarily make the person who's experiencing the abuse the person who has to push for that all the time. So I would say we have to believe people have experienced this a lot more and take action immediately, and that includes bringing in tech companies to take material down.
Jaden?
Thank you. I think it's about escalation. I think it's about looking around at what the original motivators are and figuring out how we could stop them before that happens. So for one, education. Can we standardize the fact that online and the internet in general is going to be a really big part of growing up in 2024? You absolutely have to be aware of how to use that responsibly, starting from elementary school. But I think on the legislative side, and that's a lot of the work that we've done when sitting down with MPs working to legislate the internet, we have to look at what people have commonalities on, what can we all agree on, what can everybody have a shared experience on, and that experience is frequently, there is hate on the internet. We do see it, people are impacted by it. What are the solutions? The first section of Bill C-63 is a really great example of how we can break down the vulnerabilities of who's out there and who's actually being impacted, and what are some of the first steps that we can take to really make sure people are safe on the internet. But turn it around, right? You mentioned young people around Canada don't understand that what they're doing is illegal. They don't even understand that there are repercussions, because quite frequently there aren't, and there isn't people that are going to turn around and create consequences for actions on the internet. So it's a really big concern, and something we all need to kind of wake up to, in part, as a society, to take action on.
Okay. Well, we'll pick up on the online harms bill a little bit later in this town hall, but you know, we have heard the criticism that big tech and social media platforms are not doing enough to address online harms and cyberbullying. And this fall, we heard more Ontario school boards stepping forward. They are suing social media platforms like Snapchat, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok for harming, in their point of view, the mental health of children. Now, we did speak to representatives of big tech here in Canada. They talked to us about what they were doing to address online harm and cyberbullying. Take a listen.
Every piece of content uploaded to TikTok is moderated and reviewed either by machine or by humans or both. And when there is a violation, that is removed. The user who posted it will receive a notification. They have the opportunity to appeal that. We publish quarterly community guidelines enforcement reports that outline the speed in which we're able to remove violative videos. And we break that down actually by country and by the type of policy violation. Depending on the type of violation, and if repeated violations, they could have their account or their device banned from TikTok.
We work with governments around the world. We really see this as a shared challenge and a shared responsibility. And so, you know, we would do a number of things to work with governments, whether that's on, you know, partnering on the disinformation or misinformation landscape, making commitments around how we're going to safeguard our platforms, having transparency, not only about how our products and tools work, but how they're performing. And making that publicly available. So we're on this kind of continuous journey of improvement and of partnership.
People who are indicating to us that they are of a, that are of a certain age, that are kind of, you're in your teen years, that we actually default the accounts into the most privacy protective settings, meaning that you actually aren't able to, or an adult can't interact with you unless you're already connected with them because they're a parent or a family friend. If they're unknown to you, they can't kind of automatically message you. We want to make sure that certain types of content on our platforms are not recommended to you if you're of a certain age. And we also ensure that we give you certain tools to ensure that you're able to actually control your experience. So for example, you can block out certain keywords in terms of messages and posts that people leave for you, so that those things actually don't appear if someone tries to write something that is not nice, that's negative.
And we've invested a lot in technology and resources to address child sexual exploitation on the service. Just to give you a sense of the impact in the data, in 2022, we suspended about 2.3 million accounts under our child sexual exploitation policies. In 2023, we suspended 12.4 million accounts, becoming way more aggressive on people that were, seeking this content, trying to traffic in this content. We've forged new and exciting partnerships to share information across platforms to get these bad actors off our services, and partnering closely with government on this and making a ton of progress. So child safety is certainly top priority for us, and just making sure it's a safe service for minors.
Okay, so listening to that, I'll begin with you, Matthew. Are big tech companies doing enough to protect users?
I think there are definitely positive steps that they've taken. I think there are certainly more things they can be doing. It's been really encouraging for us to see them doing some things that the youth in our research asked for, particularly things like creating a safer experience for teen users, because the youth in our research said that you're not an adult the moment you turn 13. There's a tremendous amount of growth that happens between 13 and 18. And so there are definitely steps that online platforms can do to minimize and mitigate online conflict, things to encourage empathy, things to discourage people from responding too quickly, things that they can do to change their algorithms so they're less likely to share or recommend polarizing content, and generally things that they can do in that way to change particularly the default settings of their platforms so that they are encouraging positive use, so that they're encouraging empathetic use, and so that they're minimizing conflict and particularly retributive cyberbullying. Because we know among youth, the most common causes, the most common motivations for cyberbullying are getting back at someone else. And so it's interrupting that cycle of cyberbullying where I think platforms in their default settings and in their basic design have a tremendous role they could still be playing.
Jayden, what do you say? As someone who's in the front lines of this one with young people, what would you say to whether or not big tech is doing enough?
Google sold out millions of young Canadians and young people internationally under 18 by allowing Meta to promote downloading Instagram on YouTube, which significantly is getting into people under 18 is being put in front of them. And those are the same companies that you just watched saying there are these measures. So when there isn't the government regulation that's stopping this, and people aren't waking up to this is happening, organizations, big tech is taking advantage of millions of young people vulnerable on the internet, whether they claim something else. That's what's happening. Look at the facts, see what's going on, and then say, are these measures actually doing anything, or is this virtue signaling to try to get a response to the public and to make us not aware of what's actually happening?
Anis, I'll bring you in at this point. And you said earlier that the laws can't do everything, but should there be higher guardrails?
I think there's a possibility, and there's certainly room to ask social media operators to fulfill some statutory duties. So for instance, having a process in place through which users can flag categories of harmful content, I think would be beneficial. Then even for categories of extremely harmful content, for instance, content that sexualizes a minor, I think it's acceptable to have even a specific time frame for social media operators to process those flags. I do think, however, that we have to avoid asking, either explicitly or implicitly through laws, to social media operators to proactively monitor, surveil, and take down speech.
Mm-hmm. Although, you know, Cynthia, that raises an interesting question, though, because if we're having a debate as to how to move forward here, do big tech companies have to be more accountable?
They absolutely do. And to be completely honest, it's a little bit difficult to take the statements that we've heard seriously by this point in time, because right now we're 5, 10, 15 years, almost 2 decades into having social media as a daily part of our lives. And these are multi-billion, multinational companies that have arguably shaped elections, contributed to genocides, but this is the one place where their hands are tied and they can't do anything about it. And so even when they try, we see deficiencies there too. So even though they say, oh, we are addressing hate speech online, it seems to be very selective application of who gets thrown the book at them and who is treated with leniency. For example, women are constantly reporting how X, formerly Twitter, has routinely ignored when they report misogynistic abuse. Human Rights Watch recently published a report talking about how Meta has been systemically censoring and suppressing pro-Palestinian voices on their platform, and yet they are not addressing the really overt, low-hanging fruit instances of hate speech. I think the bigger question, though, is that even if they were doing everything right, we are still then reliant on the goodwill of a handful of CEOs in the world to control our online environments. And that's just not a tenable system for a healthy online environment and a healthy, free and open democracy, because we've seen what happened with X just due to the one ownership change, and it already had such a huge impact. And so that's why, even though regulation and legislation is not the only solution, I think it definitely has to be part of the solution.
Okay, part of the solution, as you're saying, we are going to talk a bit about the regulation and the regulatory sphere in a moment. But, you know, Aruna, in terms of as things are right now, is there a role for education, for example, for women, their families, their children who are victims of this type of abuse to know a bit more as to how they might protect themselves?
I think there's a role for education, but I would just point out some of the important triggers within the speeches that we just heard from big tech companies. They talked about protecting their own companies, not protecting the people on their websites. And they talked about protecting those who they deem worthy of respect and protection, such as minors. They didn't necessarily talk about racialized women or immigrants or people who receive, who again have to use their tech to stay in touch with people and be connected to the world, the wider world. And they also didn't take their clues from survivors, from people who've said, you know what, it's not necessarily just the hate speech that I am concerned about. It's that, just to give you an example, somebody might have said to them, when I send you a bunch of red roses, that's the day I'm going to kill you. And they'll use their harassment product by sending pictures of red roses on their direct messages or online. That's not hate speech, but that's harassment and that's stalking. And it's usually happening privately, which is, again, something that the tech companies will not take on. They have not said that they're going to make any changes there. The tools that we do offer at Women's Shelters Canada include things like the digital safe breakup tool. So when you're breaking up from a relationship, there's all kinds of ways that your tech might be connected to somebody else's, whether it's passwords, whether it's access, whether it's different ways that you've sort of built a way of combining your tech usage. The tool offers very clear advice on how to separate that and then how to keep yourself safe afterwards. So two-factor authentication, changing all your passwords, turning off your location, apps, all of those things are important steps. And yet, when just about women's safety, Turning off your location may mean that also you wouldn't be able to be found if you were in a dangerous situation. So women have to choose, am I safe in this situation or not safe in this situation? Do I have my location on or my location off? Once again, it's back to individuals to make decisions to keep themselves safe and make them responsible, which is fine up until a point, and everybody should be educated on how to use tech safely. But it's not fine when that's all the responsibility we see.
Aniruddha, thank you for that. Now, we've already touched on the regulatory sphere, and in the United Kingdom, in 2023, the Online Safety Act became law. Now, and part of that law obliges platforms to have systems and processes in place in order to protect against harmful content. Now, the European Commission adopted the Digital Services Act to further protect online users. And take a listen now to two people who were instrumental in getting that legislation passed.
The first thing that we did was we put in data protection for children. And people don't always understand how making children more private makes them safer. Fundamentally, you're taking them out of the business model. You're saying, you may not have our children's attention, on this basis. The second thing we've done is introduce the Online Safety Act, and that gets very specific about what content you can recommend and can't recommend to children under 18. So we are age gating pornography. We are saying that self-harm and suicide ideation is not suitable for under 18s. And so we have made a move on that, and we've given a very big suite of powers to a regulator to get information, and in particular to get information for the coroner if a child has died. So we've seen these horrible, horrible situations all over the world where children have been pushed into a sort of a state of despair that is so great that they take their own life. And we now in England have the right to look and see, what was the company recommending? What was the company suggesting to the child? Because it's not neutral. It's not neutral what they're doing.
In Europe now we have the law, which means that the Commission can say to the platform, the big ones, and we have 19 big platforms and systems which have more than 45 million users a month. That's the parameter. So now the big change is that the Commission, who is the enforcer of the Digital Services Act, can say, look, you did not take measures which really mitigate the risks, which protect the children, and which create the system where nobody will be endangered. It's first and foremost the duty of the parents to be aware of what their children are doing, what they read, and where they disappear when they go online. And no regulation will, deprive the parents of their parental responsibility. That's their primary task. In the EU, we simply decided to introduce legally binding rules. And it was also because of the appearance of smaller systems. You mentioned Google, Meta, and others. Yes, the biggest ones had agreement with us, but there were more and more platforms and digital systems which were not part of the voluntary commitments. So that's why at the end of the day, the big platforms introduce the rules which will cover all of us. So this is what we did.
Now, here in Canada, the Online Harms Bill, Bill C-63, is stalled in Parliament, and critics have pointed to some concerns that it might limit free speech. Others are pointing to concerns about how much it would cost to set up and monitor hate speech online, online abuse. And recently, I did sit down with the Federal Justice Minister, Arif Virani. We talked about the bill and also what his government is willing to do to get it passed. Listen, let's begin with the timing here, because it took your government years to introduce a bill to address online abuse. And only after months of delay in the House, you announced that you will be splitting the bill in order to get it moving quickly. Why did it take so long to get to this point?
Well, I'd say to you that we consulted extensively on the bill because we wanted to get it right. We looked at domestic expertise, we looked at international comparators. That took time, years in fact, and we tabled a very comprehensive bill in February. In the spring, we started debate on this bill, and I thought that was a promising start. After Labor Day, we returned to the House of Commons. We also recommenced debate on this bill. I was encouraged by that as well. What I've unfortunately seen for the last 3 months is a complete blockage of the chamber that is right behind me, and that's been frustrating. It's been frustrating to me as a parliamentarian. It's been frustrating to me as Minister of Justice, who's put a lot of effort and thought into this very piece of legislation. Now we're approaching Christmas. I had a tough decision to make. Do I want to see this bill die on the order paper, or do I want to see parts of this bill expedited where I believe that we can reach some consensus? I chose the latter. I think it's an important decision because ultimately my job is to protect Canadians, and I'm going to target the most vulnerable Canadians, which are our kids. And I approach that from that vein that protecting and combating hate against hate is important, but protecting kids, including kids who might face fatal dangers, is urgent, and I'm proceeding with urgency on the parts of this bill where I believe I can achieve a consensus.
Okay, so you think you can achieve the consensus, and we look at this, the Bill C-63, the Online Harms Act. It again will now consist of 2 parts. One part will deal with keeping children safe online, which includes sexploitation, pornography. The second part relates to the Criminal Code and Human Rights Act, which includes the controversial section on free speech. Given that you have split the bill and the priority is the section on child safety, do you think you will be able to pass the second part of this, which you have said would give Canadians a recourse on discriminatory hate speech?
Well, I'm certainly hopeful, Michael, and I want Canadians to understand that when you bifurcate the bill, we are not leaving one part aside. We will still be pursuing both pieces of legislation. We'll be pursuing the portions that deal with addressing children with prioritization, working very, very quickly on those. But the portions that relate to amending the Criminal Code and amending the Canadian Human Rights Act remain on the floor of the legislature for debate and further study. I think what is also clear to all Canadians is that we have seen rising hatred in this country. There are a lot of ideas about what we should do in terms of how to address that hatred. We've heard people that support the bill. We've heard people that want the bill refined to provide more clarity. I'm all ears and willing to entertain good faith suggestions to improving the hatred components of this bill, but also to improving the portions that deal with combating child sex predation, and also things like bullying, inducing a child to self-harm, and the sharing of what's called revenge porn. These are critical things that help keep our kids safe. I think what's now clear is that the ball is in the court of my opposition parliamentarian colleagues. I've already had good indications from the Bloc Québécois, the NDP. The Conservative Party has unfortunately been blocking everything in the chamber right behind me for 3 months now, but I've been given some reason for optimism that even the Conservatives will get behind this bill because they appreciate the urgency and appreciate the need to proceed in a nonpartisan manner.
Okay, so perhaps a political path forward. But I also wonder about what your government is doing to ensure big tech social media platforms are putting in place the guardrails they promise to prevent or reduce online abuse.
Well, I'll say to you, Michael, that it's been frustrating because what we've seen is a checkerboard response, right? We've seen some companies taking pretty aggressive steps, others taking very few steps. What we're trying to do is eliminate that checkerboard, provide Canadians with the stability and understanding that regardless of which platform your child is on, which app that they are using, for example, that this will address the safety of children online across the board and set a new floor. What I've been encouraged by, Michael, is actually has been the response of social media companies thus far, as opposed to rolling up the sleeves, gloves off, getting ready for battle. It has been quite the opposite. Social media companies have been reaching out to me in my office, considering ways of how they can collaborate with us in order to get this across the finish line. I think it's helped by the fact that we are the 6th or the 7th democracy in the Western world that is moving in this area. They've already seen what other international allies have done in this area. They've realized that more needs to be done to protect children around the world and in Canada, and they're willing to work with us in that regard.
Okay. Now, I do wonder, in the time we have left, I wonder what, in your opinion, will happen if Bill C-63 does not pass before the House is dissolved and another election takes place?
Well, if you take your cues from what the official opposition has presented as their proposed alternative, There is some consideration about criminal code reform, but that's it. And I think that's problematic because what I've heard from law enforcement and what I've heard from parents, including people like Carol Todd, the mother of Amanda Todd, is that the victimization of her daughter still occurs 10 years after her death. The reason why is because images of Amanda's naked body continue to circulate online 10 years after she passed by suicide. What she wants and what the police have told me that they want to deliver is for those images to simply come down. That is possible with this piece of legislation because it imposes duties on social media platforms and requires them to take down child sex abuse material and revenge porn within a 24-hour time period. So I'm very confident that that's the right solution. It needs to pass, and that's why I'm putting a lot of effort and political capital on the line to ensure that by bifurcating, we can proceed with speed on the parts where we can achieve a consensus. I have confidence in the better principled nature of my colleagues in the chamber from other parties and their willingness to work in a nonpartisan way to keep kids safe. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, lives are at stake here, and that's important.
Okay, so our thanks there to the Justice Minister. So a lot to unpack. Matthew, you know, as I said, this bill is currently stalled. The government may fall before it's actually passed. If it does not pass, is there enough in the toolbox to address concerns about vulnerable youth, vulnerable individuals without this being passed by Parliament?
I couldn't say if there's enough in the toolbox. There definitely still are tools in the toolbox. And one of the most important of those is making sure that this conversation stays on the national conversation, that this topic is not forgotten, that the idea of improving our online spaces is not abandoned. In many cases, the threat or the possibility of regulation can be as effective, or even in some cases more effective than regulation itself. And it's also important that people be aware of the power that we have, not just as citizens, although that is of course essential, but as consumers as well, because the business model of almost every single one of these platforms is also a point of leverage because they make money by advertising. And that is where we as consumers have, in many cases, the strongest voice. We can make them change their business models, we can make them change their practices, and we have. They have changed their business models and their practices in response to consumer pressure and threat of regulation. If we keep this topic a part of the national conversation, if we don't let it go, we may not get every change we want, but we will continue to get changes to make a more positive online space.
Okay. Jayden, I'll bring you in right now because you were mentioning the sphere of legislation. So when you look, again, it's stalled, but when you look at what's in C63, does it go far enough?
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. It has to do with when the government or the public has a reaction to a big issue that the private sector is taking on, they do make changes in order to retain their viewing. That's what they need. That's what they need to succeed. And so one of the things that Young Politicians of Canada put out was the mandate to have young representation on the Digital Safety Commission. So those are people the most vulnerable that are using the internet constantly, that are largely affected by C63, but to actually have their voices in what changes could be made. So this is not a commission where you have one person saying, this is what can go on the internet, this is what can't, this is what freedom of expression is, this is what's not. It's about democracy. It's about having multiple voices. And this has gotten a lot of endorsement even from the ministers and other stakeholders in government. So we want to see this debate, but young people also want to see something get passed. And even if it's not the entire section of the bill and what the entirety of it means, something needs to happen in this term in order to have a right doing by Canadians. Just as the minister said, we need to have something passed to protect the internet for young people.
You know, and he said, as I said, as this is stalled, there are concerns, and one of them is the impact this would have on free speech. Can you address that a bit, because that is a major criticism of the current legislation?
Sure, and I'll focus my concerns with respect to Part 1 of the bill, so the Online Harms Act, because of course this is a very lengthy bill. So with respect to the Online Harms Act, I think what the bill gets mostly right, is very specific statutory duties on social media operators to act on very serious types of harmful content. For instance, content that sexualizes a child, intimate content shared without consent, things like that. Where I think that the bill needs to be improved and amended, frankly, is when it creates very broad and even vague statutory duties on social media operators. For instance, the duty to mitigate the risks that users will be exposed to 7 categories of harmful content. What that really means, well, nobody really knows because a lot is left to future regulations. So I think it's really important to make sure that social media operators do not use this type of duty, of statutory duty, and try to comply with it by engaging in proactive monitoring of speech and takedown of speech, or by taking down content, flagged content, without even reviewing it, or reviewing it, but with the help of AI, artificial intelligence, and without any human involvement, and without any necessary transparency as to the decision-making process, which can be particularly problematic when you think of categories that are a lot more subjective in nature, including hate speech.
So Anis uses the word problematic. I'm wondering from the human rights perspective, there is also the concern that because there is a role here for the Human Rights Commission, that could bog down the whole process. Can you talk about that, Cynthia?
Absolutely. So the problem with that particular, I believe you're referring to Part 3 of the legislation, is that the Canadian Human Rights Commission is already so backlogged, and this would give it a whole additional area of responsibility. And so not only is the concern that it might not end up being as helpful as we would like to see it in addressing the issues, but another issue that people have brought up is the possibility of it being gamed or weaponized and it backfiring against the very point of having such a commission and its role to address hate speech. So for example, the same way that we've seen content moderation features being weaponized to silence women, racialized people, and historically marginalized groups, people could raise complaints to the Human Rights Commission doing similarly, to tie up people to silence speech that they don't like, to silence people who are justifiably speaking out against harms. And so we would want to make sure that any entity that's put in place, whether it's the commission and whatever additional staff is hired, or this new Digital Safety Commission, that they have an explicit commitment to substantive equality, which is recognizing that we don't exist in level playing field. And so different groups, if we're to be honest about the existent landscape of society, are treated differently. And so that concept has to be taken into account for it to be effective on the ground.
Nurida, you're nodding your head there to what Cynthia was saying. So what do you think we need to see from the federal government, from regulators and lawmakers in this country?
So I agree that the regulations are one of the places where you can actually bring in some of the voices of those who are most harmed by online behavior, and it must be trauma-informed. That's the other thing that I think is often missing when you are looking at any form of legislation. Of course, it's often written in very sweeping ways, but the way it's applied needs to be informed by those who experience that harm, those who are most affected by it. And we have to have spaces to talk about that and to share that information and then apply it, implement it, and then measure it. Where is it making a change? How has it changed our behavior? Who is now seeing improvements in their life because of any regulations or legislation that's brought in? There are other telecoms companies, there are other companies working and acting online, the banks, that have a responsibility also to their own behavior online and how their applications, how their interfaces are spaces that can create harm also. And I would like to see them included in this conversation.
this conversation, as you say. And it is just the start, so thank you to everyone involved there. And we will continue to have the conversations in the days, weeks, months, and years to come. Now, we know that cyberbullying and online abuse is on the rise. We also know that it is taking a toll on the mental health of Canadians. So if anyone who is watching this, seeing this, is struggling right now as a result of online harm or cyberbullying, a reminder that there is a national suicide crisis line to reach for help. All you need to do is dial 988. And with that, I want to thank our panelists for taking part in this portion of the discussion: Matthew Johnson, Anis Boussière-McNichol, Jaden Braves, Anurada Dugal, and Cynthia Koo. Thank you very much for being a part of this. And in the coming months, we will be posting on cpac.ca more information, more of the interviews on this very important subject matter. You can also check for it on the CPAC YouTube channel. I'm Michael Serapio. For everyone here at CPAC, thank you for joining us in this important town hall on online harm and cyberbullying. Take care.